Welcome back to my channel. My name is Claire and this is Penguin and Pear. Today we're talking all about slippery, hard to sew fabrics. So I don't know about you, but I for one am someone who has always avoided slippery fabrics as much as I can. The last year or two I've felt a little bit more confident with them. I hold my hands up, I'm still not there 100%, I have to be honest. So yesterday I finally finished a dress that I started nearly a year ago. Those of you who have been with me for a while might remember a video I did about the indigo dress by Tilly and the Buttons. Best part of a year ago. Well, at that time I cut this fabric out and I sewed it up. I just didn't do the neckline, and yesterday I finished the neckline and got it all finished. This is fabric gifted to me by Minerva. There will be a blog post on their site, I'll link it down below. As I was attaching this bias binding for a bias binding video I've got coming up, I thought, why not give you my ninja tips for sewing with stupid, horrible, it's not stupid, is it? It's that teenager, you know, the one where you ask them to do something and they do the complete opposite. A delinquent. This was a delinquent fabric. Anyway, I've made that dress, so it's inspired me to come here and share all my ninja tips with you. Not only my tips, but I've collated lots and lots from the internet. I have 25 tips to share with you. So what do I mean by difficult to sew fabrics? I think it's important for you to know that before we get into the tips. So for me, difficult to sew fabrics are any fabrics that are lightweight, sheer fabrics, for example. So chiffons, georgettes, silks, maybe a silk viscose, something like that. So I've got 25 tips for you, so this is going to be a bonanza of a video, so do stay through to the end. I will put timestamps down below. So the first ninja tip I have for you is to overlock the edges of your fabric as soon as you get your fabric. This is something I don't do and I've got to do. I think I just feel a bit overwhelmed by the idea of going through and doing it to all my fabrics I own. But overlock your fabric as soon as you get it. Whether you have a serger and you can whiz it through the serger, or you're doing it on your sewing machine with an overcast stitch or a zigzag stitch, finish the edges of your fabric. One main feature of difficult to sew or lightweight fabrics is that they do tend to fray, as any woven fabric can fray. You're going to want to secure the edges of your fabric before you do the next tip. And the next tip is to pre-wash your fabrics in a way that you will be doing when you wear your garment. Does that make any sense? I don't know. So basically what I'm saying is, however you're going to wash your garment after you've made it, wash the fabric before you make the garment in that exact same way. Now there is a little caveat here. If it's a real delicate fabric, such as one that you will have dry cleaned, then you don't want to do this. Perhaps have it dry cleaned before you cut into it. But for most fabrics, just pre-wash it in exactly the same way. This serves three functions. So firstly, if your fabric's going to shrink, it will shrink at this point and it will save a ton of tears when you've cut your fabric out, made it, washed it, and then it doesn't fit you. Also, if you like to colour block, it's going to save more tears later on when you've colour blocked with two really different hues, put it in the machine and then it comes out an all horrible funny colour. So if you wash your fabric before you sew with it, if it's going to run, it will run and it will get rid of any of the residue of the dyes as well. And also, if you have a delicate fabric, they can be prone to water stains and it will eradicate that up front. So you've overlocked your fabric, you've put it in the washing machine and it's ready to use. The next thing you really need to do is to practice on a scrap piece of the fabric. Difficult to sew fabrics are just that, they are difficult to sew, and it can take lots of manipulation and changing of settings and using specific tools to get your stitches looking really good. So you might want to look at the tension of your sewing machine, the type of needles you're using, the sewing machine foot you're using, the stitch length, all sorts of things, and you need to play with all of those settings on a scrap piece until you've got it looking exactly right. That will stop any problems, in particular any puckering, and will really help you. I will talk in depth about that a little bit further down the line. The next one, which is the last tip within the prep section, and oh, you're gonna love it. I love it. When I discovered it, it changed my sewing experience with sewing these nightmare fabrics. I did it to this one, and that is to starch your fabric before you start to sew. So you may have come across a fabric that's really slippery, it slides through your fingers, it doesn't stay still. When you're trying to sew two layers together under the sewing machine, it shifts all over the place. No matter how many pins you use, it just does not stay still, and then your stitches look really amateur. Are you with me? We've all been there, haven't we? I know I certainly have. Well, fear no more. You do not need to avoid these fabrics anymore because you have starch spray. Just beware that if it's a fabric that you're not going to put in the washing machine or you're not going to hand wash, then you don't want to do this. But as long as you can wash the starch out, you are good to go. Do test it before you go and spray the whole thing. Test it on a little bit, wash it, see how it washes out. Just give your fabric a spray, let it dry, and then it will stiffen up and it will be like a more of a medium weight fabric. You can sew with it, it'll be really easy. It'll be quite matte as well, and it'll just be generally a lot easier to manage. So the next section I want to talk to you about is pressing, and I debated whether to put this in its own section, but I really think it deserves it, and I've got a few really good tips to share with you. So pressing can either be a help or a hindrance when you're sewing a garment. Am I right? Am I right? Don't get me wrong, pressing is so important and you should do it, but some fabrics respond better to pressing than others. And so the first thing I want you to do is to test a scrap piece of fabric under the iron. This is so important, especially with lightweight fabrics, because it can leave an awful sheen on the fabric if you're not careful. So you want to find out how it reacts to heat and how it reacts to your pressing it up front before you ruin your garment. And basically, you want to look out for shininess or melting, because if it's any kind of poly fabric, it may melt. And that's something you need to be able to assess before you start pressing your garment as you go. So the next tip I have for you is to use a pressing cloth. Now they do recommend that you use silk organza because it won't melt and you can see through it. To be honest, I'm too frugal to pay for that. I know it's a little scrap piece you need. No, I just tend to get a scrap piece of cotton that I'm not using and put that between the iron and my fabric, and that works just as well. You can't see as well through it, but do you really need to at the end of the day? My next pressing tip for you is to press, don't iron. So when we iron clothes, we go back and forwards like this, and we're actually dragging the fabric and potentially distorting it. When you're making a garment, you do not want to do this, because as I say, you will distort the fabric and then your garment won't sew together as you need it to. And it might not fit you, it might be too baggy. And bring the iron down vertically, leave it on where it is for a few seconds, lift it up, move to the next section, lift it up, move to the next section, and then you will not distort your fabric. The next pressing tip is a ninja tip, and that is block fusing. So this is something that tailors do when they make clothes professionally. So if you've got any interfacing that you need to apply to your pattern pieces, take a piece of fabric and a piece of interfacing and fuse the interfacing to the fabric before you cut out either interfacing or fabric. Are you still with me? Do that So you've got a whole area of interfaced fabric, and then you can cut your pattern pieces out. And there's a few things that that's going to do. When you press the interface in, it could shrink. So if you apply all the heat before you cut it out, any shrinkage then occurs, and then you cut it out and you've got the piece in the exact size you need. And the last tip, which is a super ninja one, do not omit this. And I talked about this in my video where I talked about sewing myths. If you haven't seen that, you will want to check that out. But I talked about this there. And press your garment throughout the sewing procedure or the process. So it can be so tempting to be at your sewing machine, get really carried away with sewing and not want to get up and press your garment as you go. But if you do, it will be so much more professional at the end. It just ensures accuracy, and the garment will lay flatter, it will lay as it's intended in the end result. It is so important. And also pressing. So when you, say for example, if you're pressing hems up, creates a crease line, and that makes sewing much easier, especially with these lightweight fabrics, because where they're fiddly. There's no other word for it. They are fiddly. And if you have that line to follow, that's going to make it a little bit easier. But do make sure you press all along, because it's just going to reduce shifting as well. So now we're moving on to the next section, and that's cutting out your lightweight, slippery, hard to sew fabrics, which can be a complete and utter nightmare. I don't know about you, but I've had times where I have just avoided working with garments that need to be cut out, especially if they're lightweight and oh, I've got this fabric. I'll put some B-roll up of it so you can see it. And I bought it maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I love it, but it is so slippery. But I'm not going to avoid it anymore. It's a gorgeous X designer fabric, and I really want to make like a shirt dress with it. So the first pro tip I have for you with cutting out fabrics is to purchase, if you don't already own, a cutting mat and a rotary blade. I absolutely swear by them. I use scissors and a rotary blade at different times because they both have their pluses and their minuses. In some cases, a rotary blade is better than scissors, and this is definitely one of those times. So when you're cutting out slippery fabrics, or any fabrics in fact, and you're using scissors, you have to lift the fabric up in order to cut it. And that can potentially distort or move the fabric. With slippery fabrics, you don't need to know how to get it moving around. And so scissors, in my opinion, scissors are not appropriate for slippery fabrics or these fabrics lightweight that are hard to sew, because it's just going to give you a much harder time. I know some people do struggle with a rotary blade, but it is worth persevering with, because once you master it, you will not look back. So with a mat, you can lay your fabric down and you can tape it down, as we're going to get to in a minute, and then put pattern weights on it, all sorts, and then you just bring the rotary blade across it, and you are not going to have to lift it or move it at all. If you've done all the prep and you are using a rotary blade, it's nice and quick. You can get straight lines, and if you can't cut in a straight line with a rotary blade, just use a ruler next to it and do it. That's what I do. But if you are determined that you want to use scissors, then make sure they're micro-serrated scissors. So micro-serrated scissors are scissors where they've got little incy-wincy blades along the blade of the scissors, so tiny that I don't think you can see them with the naked eye. Certainly not with my eyesight, you can't. So when you've got micro-serrated scissors, as I've got here, and you go to cut, the scissors will grip the fabric and then cut it, making it a lot more accurate. Obviously mistakes can still happen, especially if you don't have a steady hand like I don't. But as I say, I do prefer rotary blades rather than scissors. So the next pro tip I have for you is a good one. It's one I do with all my fabrics, let alone the hard to sew ones, and that is to work with smaller pieces of fabric. I know some people have their whole stretch of fabric and then they pin all the pieces and Tetris it together and get the best configuration that they can come up with. I ain't got no time for that, and I haven't got room for that, even though I do have a few tables in here at the moment. But I do tend to see how long my pattern piece is and then cut a piece just bigger than that and work with that. And I think with these fabrics, these lightweight, fly away, happy-go-lucky fabrics, I think this is really going to play into your strengths if you can do this. It's just going to make it more manageable. And something else I do when I'm cutting out my fabric is I rough cut around the pattern pieces. So I just cut roughly around it, maybe an inch or so more. And then when I've just got that piece of fabric and that pattern piece, I will then go in and do it all accurately. The next ninja tip, this is a ninja one, and this is something in the past I've tried to avoid doing this, and then I've given up and done it anyway because the way I do it isn't accurate, and the way that I'm going to suggest you do it is a lot more accurate, and that is to cut out on a single layer of fabric. So often we fold the fabric over and cut a mirrored piece. So you might, like for your back piece, you'd cut it on the fold, and your front piece, maybe your sleeves as well, all sorts of things. I generally cut on the fold just because it makes it easier to cut out. But with lightweight fabrics, you really do want to cut it on a single layer. All you've got to do with your pattern piece that is cut on the fold is lay it down, cut around it, and then flip it over and then cut around the other side. Could get a bit of tracing paper, fold it over, then trace it, and then when you open it up, you've got a whole pattern piece. And sometimes doing that, you can actually use less fabric, so it is worth looking into, and I would definitely cut on a single layer. So if you do want to cut out 2 layers at once, something you can do is put tissue paper underneath and above, and then sandwich your pieces in the middle, and that will stop them or reduce the shifting around. So the next ninja tip for you is to make sure you are cutting out on the grain. This is something, when I was new to sewing, I just could not get my head around the idea of cutting on the grain. Well, I knew the theory behind it because you've got the warped and the weft, as I've spoken about in previous videos, and you want to make sure it is cut on the, I don't know which is the warped, which is the weft, I can't remember, pull it on screen, but you want to make sure your fabric is straight, and that is going to help your fabric keep it, well, your garment keep its shape afterwards. On your pattern piece you will see an arrow. It's usually a vertical arrow. If the pattern piece is to be cut on the bias, it'll be a diagonal. Very occasionally you might see a horizontal arrow, and that is just the grain of the fabric. So all you want to do when you put your pattern piece down is measure from the edge of the fabric to that arrow at the top, and then at the bottom of the arrow as well. When you want to cut on the grain, before you do that, you can actually tape your fabric down to the table. So if it's really slippery, just get some masking tape or some washi tape or anything, and just tape it down so that it doesn't move. So you've taped your fabric down, you've got it exactly as you want it, and you need to make use of weights and silk pins as well. All pins are not made equally, and maybe this is something I'll talk about in the future a bit more. But for light drapey, difficult to sew, chiffon-y type fabric, excuse me, my neckline keeps going all the way up there, it's driving me mad. For the types of fabrics we're talking about today, you want to use silk pins because any of the other pins would be too thick for your fabric. So my personal process is that I put weights down on the fabric first, all over. I use them everywhere. So you can use anything for pattern weights. You could use tins of beans or anything that's got any kind of weight to it, really. I use these. So these are just washers from the hardware store. Whatever pattern weights you are using, you want to put them all over your fabric. Keep it nice and steady. Along with the tape, it is not going to move. And once you've done that, you can then pin using your silk pins. So you've taped down your fabric, you've got your weights all over, your baked beans or whatever you are using. And then you want to use your silk pins. Now I do try to say not to buy too many products for sewing because you can sew quite minimally, but silk pins are really, really worth the money, and I do recommend them because they're lightweight and they will not ruin, they won't snag your fabric. With that said, you do want to just pin within the seam allowance if you're working with slippery or lightweight fabrics, and always pin vertically, and then that's going to ensure there will be no holes in your fabric. And the only other thing to say about pinning is to pin like crazy. The more pins you have, the more control you have. So now we're getting on to the final section, which is the sewing section. If you're still with me, thank you so much for watching. I hope you are getting value from this. If you are, do hit that like button down below, as that really helps and tells YouTube that I'm producing quality content for you. So when you're sewing, the tips I'm going to take you through are going to ensure that you have a really good, beautiful stitch and that your sewing is going to be super accurate. So the first thing you want to look at is your sewing machine settings. So you want to know your stitch length needs to be a little bit shorter than it would normally. So I normally sew at 2.5. So I would sew a lightweight fabric at maybe 2, maybe even 1.5. It really depends on how lightweight the fabric is. Basically, the lighter weight the fabric, the smaller you want the stitch, and the more heavyweight, the thicker or the longer you want your stitch. For example, if I sewed with canvas fabric, I would sew at a 3.5 maybe. That would just give the stitches more room for the thicker fabric, and it goes the other way with the lightweight fabric, so you do want a smaller stitch. Also want to look at tension. If your sewing machine has the option to alter your tension, you may need to do that. But do have a little sew and see what the tension's like before you play around with that. Now you also will need to make sure, and this is so important, that you have the right needles and the right sewing machine feet. So for sewing with these types of fabrics, you really want a Sharps Micro-Tex needle. You want that in a 60 to 80, depending on how heavyweight your fabric is. And for your sewing machine foot, a walking foot is going to be your friend. Now I did talk about a walking foot in my previous video where I talked about jersey fabrics, and a walking foot is going to help you with slippery fabrics as well. And the main reason for that is on the underside of the top of the walking foot, it has feed dogs like you have on the sewing machine, those little grippers that bring the fabric through. And if you use a normal foot, that doesn't have it. So you'll sew with your two pieces, it will drag one piece through, but the top piece won't come through at the same rate. Whereas if you have a walking foot, they will both come through at an even rate. And that is going to make all the difference with your sewing. I have to say, talking about all this, I am really excited for you. I would love to know, if you do try these tips, what success you have. Leave a comment even if you do it later on, do come back to this video and let me know. I am so excited because I know how frustrating it can be to sew with slippery or difficult to sew fabrics. It can be a complete nightmare. I've had times where I rip my hair out. I don't know, I'm genuinely sat here thinking, oh my God, I am so excited for you guys to be able to have a better sewing experience. I only wish I had these tips at my disposal when I started sewing. So the next tip for when you're sewing is to hand baste your seam. Now, I did this yesterday actually. Full disclosure, I was so nervous about sewing this neckline, just in case I messed it up, because where it's a delicate fabric, it can be really difficult to get a nice finish. And I was debating whether to use bias binding or a facing. I ended up using a bias binding so that I could show you guys how to do that. I hand stitched this bias binding down, but before I did that, I hand basted. I do have some hand basted thread, but you can just use any thread, to be honest. Just do a rough thread all the way through, and then you can take your pins out, and that's just going to make it easier to sew, and it won't shift around on you. And you could even do that with your side seams, not just difficult areas like the neckband, but any seams that you're sewing. If you want to make sure that the two fabrics are going to stay really close together, then do it. Why not? What harm is it going to cause? It's going to take a little bit more time. And actually, I did this on my Harper cardigan because I had to pattern match stripes on the pocket, and so I hand basted and got a very, very accurate finish because I did. And it does take more time, but in my view, it is totally, totally worth that time. Now, if you don't want to hand baste, something else you could do is glue the sides. Now, I never thought I would say this, because in order for a temporary fix to keep the fabric together, you could use a fabric glue in the seam allowance. Now, I would not use it outside of the seam allowance, just in case it doesn't wash out, and you do want to test this before you make your garment. Test it on a scrap piece of fabric, wash it as you would, and see if the residue comes off. Now, doing this, it's not an optimum thing, and I don't know if I really recommend doing it, to be honest, but it is an option for you. It may leave some residue on your needle, so do be aware of that, and it could gunk up your machine if you do it a lot. But I know you're cleaning your machine out regularly, aren't you? Just like me. So something that can happen when you're sewing a lightweight fabric is the thread can get bunched up as you're starting to sew, and then the machine swallows the fabric. We've all had that happen, haven't we? How frustrating is that? Wow, it doesn't need to be, because all you've got to do, something really, really simple, is just hold the threads as you start to sew, and then the threads can't bunch up at the back and go take the fabric down with it. I've done this a lot and had 100% success with it. My fabric never ever gets swallowed when I hold the threads. Another option, if you do tend to have problems at the beginning, maybe holding the threads isn't possible for you, maybe if you have disability and it's difficult to do that, you could start sewing on a scrap piece of fabric and then continue on with your own fabric and just cut it off, because it'll just be attached with thread. So if there's any issues when you start sewing, it will happen on that scrap bit. When you sew with that main bit of fabric, all the stitches will be absolutely fine. So the next pro tip I have for you is to go slow. I don't know about you, but when I started sewing, I seemed to think it was some kind of race. I used to see Crafty Gemini. Now, she's really well known for sewing super, super fast. In fact, I think years ago, if I remember rightly, she bought a sewing machine specifically that goes fast, because she likes to really whiz it through, and she's accurate as well. And I used to wonder, oh my god, I can't even be accurate slowly, let alone fast. And I kind of thought it was a bit of a race, if I'm honest. And so I was always trying to go faster. I think it's partly because you want to get through your garment as quickly as possible, but really take your time. And with slippery fabrics, you are going to have to go slower. If you have a function on your sewing machine where you can turn the speed down, turn the speed down. It is going to be your friend. It doesn't matter if you take an extra hour or two to make your garment. No one's going to know, are they? Just take your time and go slowly, and then your stitching will be more accurate. And that's really a lesson I can take with me in all of my sewing. The next ninja tip, pro ninja, whatever you want to call it, tip that I have for you, you're not going to like this one. I know you're not. And that is to hand sew where necessary. This is something I did kicking and screaming. I really did not want to do it. Partly because I have hand tremors, so that doesn't help matters when I'm hand sewing with a tiny little needle. But it is something that I do now. I've gotten better at it over time. When I started sewing, you would never have caught me hand stitching at all. Even my hems, my neckline, everything was sewn on the sewing machine, or even the serger if I could get away with it. And then maybe 18 months ago or so, I really started, I sort of gave myself a bit of a talking to. I said, Claire, if you want to have quality garments, you need to take your time and put the effort in and make them quality garments. I didn't hand stitch for the sake of it, don't get me wrong. No, just no, I've got a sewing machine. I'm not going to hand stitch for the sake of it. But where it is going to improve my garment, so hems, I generally hand stitch my hems down on my neckline. I know I've done it on cuffs before, like if you're making a blouse, there can be small bits around the neckline that are really fiddly to get onto the sewing machine, and that can be beneficial to hand sew. So we're almost at the end now, just one more pro tip to share with you. This is a real ninja one, and this is so important no matter what fabric you sew with, but especially your lightweight, slinky type, hard to sew fabrics. Want to know what it is? It is, I've forgotten. God, lucky I wrote notes down, isn't it? I'm so excited to tell you. You're going to be so underwhelmed, but it's so important. And that is to finish your seams. We've all been there, haven't we? I've done every mistake that you have done, or you could do, I have done in my journey, and I've learned from it. I made a dress right at the beginning of my YouTube journey, and it was, can't remember what one, but it was a thinner cacao dress, and I tested it, and I was in a rush, and I didn't bother finishing my seams, and I think it was like 2 washes in, and the seams just came apart. And it's because I did not finish my seams. And any kind of lightweight woven fabric, sometimes even more heavier weight woven fabrics, will fray, and if you do not finish your seams, you will lose your seams. That is the fact of the matter. So things you can do, something I like to do with lightweight fabrics is French seams. I think they look absolutely beautiful, but sometimes that's not appropriate, in which case you could overlock your seams. For lightweight slippery fabrics, I'm not a fan of serging seams, because where you've got 4 threads or sometimes 3 threads, the threads can be a little bit heavy. If you've got a super lightweight fabric, it could cause an imbalance. Opposite to that, if you want something to give it a bit more stability, then serging can help you out. I absolutely would not rely on pinking seams for a lightweight shifty fabric. Now the chances are it'll probably be okay, but I've had hit and miss experiences with pinking, and they're not always a perfect option for securing the edges of your seams. Personally speaking, for me, first off I would do a French seam, but if I wasn't doing a French seam, then I would overcast on the sewing machine or do a zigzag on the sewing machine. I think that would be your best bet. So I hope you enjoyed this video. You did find some value in it, and you found it a little bit entertaining. I do go out of my way to make it as entertaining for you as I possibly can. So let me know downstairs what you think of this video. Which tip did you find most helpful? Have you got any other tips to share with the community here on my channel? I know we would all benefit from your insight as well. So if you like this video and you'd like to see more, do hit that subscribe button. Do share this video with anyone you think would benefit from it. Check out my Ko-fi account as well. Just in case you didn't know, I do have memberships where I offer an extra video every month. you might want to be a part of that, and I do take requests for things to talk about in that video. Until next time, I'm going to love you and leave you. Happy sewing, have a great day. Until next time, bye for now.